I'm talking to you though. You're the stats guy.
Yeah, we're trying
You're the
to.
stats guy, and we're the homies.
What is up, homies? We are back with another prediction video, 2 in a row. I know it's pretty crazy. Before we get started, if I sound a little funny, I am a little under the weather. Apologies. Hopefully, it's not too bad, but it's part of the reason why I had enough time to put this stuff together. So, we're going to get into it. In my last video, I told you about my attempt to predict the NBA playoffs and how it was pretty unsuccessful. At the time of that video, it was exactly at 50%. I'm just going to give you a little update. Because my algorithm predicted a Celtics sweep, and they did indeed get a gentleman's sweep, it has improved. So all told, with the games that I predicted, I was at a win rate of 57 and some change percent. So better than a coin flip. Not as good as I would like, obviously. But for a very half-baked attempt at that, honestly, not bad. And one of the things about sports prediction is that it's pretty difficult, and the usual statistical bars that you set for yourself just have to be lowered because it's that difficult. So I'll get into some of that. I'll get into baseball. Baseball is currently in season. They are, oh gosh, about almost 1,000 games in all told to the season, and so that's plenty of data with which to build an algorithm to try and predict the rest of the games on the season. So I'll get into how it's doing. I'll get into what I did and some of the pitfalls I continue to encounter. Might be a long one today, so hope you're ready to get into the weeds statistically. Using my predictive algorithm, I was able to predict prospective MLB games at a rate of 100%, which might sound too good to be true, and it is, because this needs a huge asterisk. And in my little footnote, I'm going to put on June 10th. So while it's technically true that I did this, that was a single day, and actually it was only a half slate of baseball games. There's 8 that day, I think. There's usually 15. 100% though looks great on paper. Now, the lowest I've been this year is right around 47%. That is the worst day I've had. Under 50%, definitely losing money. But when you're doing prediction, and specifically when you have a strategy that says predict every single game, you don't really care about one day or another. You care about all the days in aggregate. On average, are you predicting more wins than you are predicting losses? And for me, that's true. I am positive in terms of money. And to be honest with you, that is with quite the low win rate. So my overall win rate is just over 60%. So in testing, I was just under 60%. In practice, I'm just over 60%. And so what that means is I am very slightly positive, just based on the odds I've been getting. But recently I've had somewhat of a breakthrough. And I want to talk about how I'm using the probabilities that my algorithms produce to increase my numbers from 60% to over 70%, which is a great win rate, actually. And if you're looking to make money, that's right where you need to be, is just over 70%. Before I get into baseball specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about the method I'm using to predict games, which is logistic regression. Now, if you are familiar at all with statistical prediction using inferential methods, I would say this is not going to be new for you, and you probably already understand this stuff. It's fairly simple stuff. But if you don't, this might be helpful. So the reason I use logistic regression is because it's very mathematically convenient. That is to say, it deals in odds, which is something that if you're a sports fan, you definitely are aware of, and odds are used all over the place. And it deals in probabilities, which are two sides of the same coin. So probability you can think of as P. This is a number between 0 and 1. With 1 being 100% probability of an event occurring and 0 being no probability of that event occurring. Odds are simply a probability over 1 minus that probability. Now, this is a form that's also useful because you can use odds to compare two different groups of people for research, say. Let's say you have a smoking group and a non-smoking group. Well, you can say like the smoking group has X amount odds higher than the non-smoking group to get X disease. And so in that way, it's useful. But for prediction, what's really useful is actually this probability. So another way, so I'm just going to write out how we mathematically think about logistic regression. Logistic regression is a linear combination resulting in log odds of a series of predictors. And you have your intercept or alpha term, and then you have beta coefficients, and these are just numbers. And then you have your variables themselves, the value of those variables. So if ignoring this part, it's just a linear equation, right? Y equals mx plus b. That's all it is. And then it spits out this log odds. And what we can do with this is convert it into a form where instead of log odds, we get the actual probability. And the way we do that is we put e to the power of this over 1 plus e to the power of the same thing. And then we get the probability. That's kind of a roundabout way of telling you that the reason I'm using logistic regression is because I like to get the probabilities. A probability greater than 0.5 means that the prediction is in the affirmative. So in my case, that means a win. And a probability less than 0.5 means a predicted loss. And so it's very easy to calculate. It's very straightforward to interpret. And it just gives me binary picks, win-loss. That's it. So that's the reason I'm using logistic regression. I hope this was a little helpful in letting you know. But the reason I wanted to talk about probabilities in particular is because I'm going to go more in depth about how I use probabilities over and above just giving me a simple prediction in order to juice my numbers up a little bit in terms of my win rate. So we'll talk about that. In my last video, I wrote down a not even comprehensive list of all the variables that I considered, and I told you which ones ended up making it, or might not have actually. And in this case, I'm just going to put the ones that ended up being important. I tested a ton. As you can imagine, with baseball, there's even more statistics available than with most other sports, basketball included. So there was a lot to choose from, and frankly, a lot to test, and it's been quite the process. But basically, what ends up being the most important when predicting the future is also the most simplistic, I would say. So I did lots of different things. Like instead of just doing win-loss, home and away, I did your like current win streak. So the winning percentage from your last 10 games. And that didn't end up being better than just simply doing your winning percentage for the whole season. I did things like your career ERA, your career whip for the starting pitchers. I did things like bullpen whip and ERA. And those things tend to add more noise than signal to the model. And it's very difficult to parse apart what works best. But basically, what ends up working no matter what is if you do home and away win percentage. So what's your record on the road? What's your record at home? And what's the proportion in between those. So again, a number between 0 and 1. Your Pythagorean win-loss record, which I will get into. It is an interesting formula, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense. And some starting pitcher stats, and in particular, the whip from your most previous season. So that would be for this year, the 2023 season. What was your whip last year? And whip stands for walks and hits per inning pitched. Very straightforward stat. Most guys are around 1. The league average for last year was 1.31. If you're under 1, you're a great pitcher. If you're right around 1, you're a good pitcher. And if you are like, I'd say 1.15 and above, you're sort of average. And then once you get to about 1.4, 1.5, you are not great as a pitcher, although you might be getting put into bad situations. But anyways, that's basically whip. So next, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into Pythagorean win-loss and why it's been useful when trying to predict the future, because unlike something like just your basic win percentage, it is actually less dependent on the specific game that you played and more dependent on how well your offense and defense are doing. Winning percentage, because it spits out a number between 0 and 1. And you know that that's going to be true because the numerator is always going to be larger than the denominator. But it's always going to be a non-zero number unless you haven't scored any runs that year, in which case that sucks. But basically, you take your runs to the power of 1.83 and you divide it by your runs to the power of 1.83 plus the runs you've given up to the power of 1.83, and you get something that looks just like a regular winning percentage, except that it doesn't take into account the individual games. So it's almost like if you played the season and you didn't keep track of who won and lost. All you kept track of is runs scored and runs given up. And at the end of the season, you just said, well, who scored the most runs and who gave up the most runs? And those are the best teams and those are the worst teams. It sort of reminds me of like European football or soccer, where they will use goal differential a lot in order to determine seedings and things like that. On one hand, it makes more mathematical sense to use something like this because in a certain game, you might have bad luck. Like, for instance, you might have 3 or 4 hits throughout the game, but they all come in separate innings, and you don't have a chance to score anybody. And you could think of that as bad luck because if everybody has, a 300 or so batting average, which would be really high for a whole team, but if they did, you would need some of those hitters to hit back to back, but that's not always the case. That doesn't always happen that way. So this takes the game out of the equation and just tells you purely based on that team's ability to score and prevent runs, how good are they? So on the face of it, might seem like a good idea. However, this way of calculating team success does precisely what I just said, which is it doesn't take into account the game. So for instance, if you have a really good manager and the game is tied, and the manager knows I really, really need a run, and he puts in the right pinch hitter and gets 1 run, well, that's only barely going to move your Pythagorean win-loss because you're only going to have 1 extra run, but you will have won that game. And so that game is going to factor in much more to your true win-loss percentage based on game situation because your manager was smart and he knew that a single run at the right moment wins a game, but a single run at any moment only impacts this equation so much. So actually, one of the models that has been working for me quite well, and we'll get into the numbers, is this little number, which is a model that predicts winning based on home Pythagorean theorem and the away team's Pythagorean theorem, connected by an interaction term, which means that if I were to write out the entire model, there would actually be a 5th and 6th term because there's 2 interaction terms, and it would include how these 2 things correlate with each other, so home pyth and away pyth, and then how these two things correlate with each other. That's a little bit more detail than you need probably, but basically it just improves the power a little bit because it takes more into account a very good team playing a very bad team, or a bad team playing a bad team, good team. That changes. That's allowed to change more if you have an interaction term than if you just enter them all separately. But anyways, the same model also accounts for your home winning percentage and your away winning percentage. Now, when I was specifying all these models, basically I was just trying stuff, which is not great statistical practice. But in this case, stakes are very low. I'm doing this basically for fun, so I was not worried about um, staying very true to good statistics. But I will say that it sort of makes sense, in a post hoc sort of way, where if you take just how good they are at scoring runs and preventing runs, and then you account for, that is to say, you hold constant their actual win-loss record, what you're doing is holding constant those X factors that turn runs into wins. So in essence, this is controlling for something like clutch hitting, where a player knows they need a hit or is unable to get a hit in a big spot, even though that normally they can get runs and prevent runs, but in a big spot, either they can or they can't. Or a manager that knows how to play situations very well to turn a smaller number of runs into a greater number of wins. This sort of accounts for all of that. And so I think that that's one of the reasons it's more successful than some of the other things I've tried. This model in particular has an overall win rate of just under 60%. I gave myself a little latitude here. It's about 59 and 0.8 or 0.9 or something. So actually not super great. And you might notice that that number is only slightly higher than the number that I gave you for my basketball prediction, which I considered to be not great either. Um, and if I can just talk about betting for a second, because I have been doing some testing, sparing testing with betting, because predicting more than a coin flip sounds great, but you actually have to predict quite a bit better than a coin flip in order to turn like a profit if you were betting on every game or something. So this 60% is actually not going to cut it. But if I game the probabilities a little bit, I can actually get this a lot higher. And that may just be enough overall to win more games than I'm losing and win more money than I'm losing. So I'm going to talk about that part of this whole experiment right now. So now I want to compare two of the models that I've found to be more successful than any of the others, and what I'm doing to make them even more successful than they are overall. So the one that I specified earlier, Python wins, that's going to be on the left here, and then wins and whip, which is to say your winning percentages for both teams, and then the whips of the starting pitchers from the previous season for both teams. I've started here at 50% because that is the minimum threshold. If you're not above that, then your thing is useless. Now, this has an overall win rate, like I mentioned, of just about 59%. This guy is not as good, with a win rate just over 55%. So, pretty low, actually, when you think about just prediction in general. In fact, the win rate, if you were just to pick every home team to win, is like 54% or so. And so what you want to be is much better than that number. This is 5% better, so that's something. This is just barely better. So in general, not very impressive. But if you use a probability threshold, you get a win rate on this side of 67%. And on this side, you get a win rate of closer to 80%, which is extremely high. But there's a huge caveat associated with using this. And that is, we're not taking every game now. We're only taking the games where the probabilities are greater than zero point 0.6 or less than zero point 0.4. So basically, any game where the algorithm thinks that the probability is going to be close to zero point 0.5. So let's say that the algorithm thinks it's going to be a close game. We're not looking at that game. We drop it. We only look at what the algorithm thinks are going to be sure wins or sure losses. And in that case, we can get our numbers pretty high. It's a double-edged sword, though, because an overall win rate of over 60% is going to get you into profit. And that's because if you're betting on every game, some games are going to be minus odds, some games are going to be plus odds. And in general, as a rule, these models like favorites more than they like underdogs for obvious reasons, because favorites have higher winning percentages. Favorite pitchers have lower whips. Favorite teams get more runs and prevent more runs. So it makes sense that the algorithms really like these teams. Now, occasionally betting lines will be such that your algorithm likes an underdog, and that's great. And if you're betting on every game, you're going to have a good amount of those. But if you're only betting on sure wins and sure losses, you're going to have way more favorites than you will underdogs. So my testing is going to have to account for that in terms of I know for a fact that a win rate of 67% is more than enough to turn a profit if I'm betting on every single game. Is it enough to bet on the number of games that fall within this probability threshold? I'm doubtful. And in fact, I'm even doubtful of this number because this contains even fewer games. The testing sample I used in this case is all the games from this season. So I think right now in my data set, I have about 800. You have to drop the first 10 or 15 or so games for every team because the Pythagorean and the win percentage looks really weird at the beginning of the season. So, for instance, through the first couple of series, a team might have a winning percentage of 100, and that could really skew the prediction. And so it's easier to do a run in, what's called a run in period, and just drop the first 10 games, and then you have somewhat normalized winning percentages and Pythagorean winning percentages, and then you can use that data. So it lessens the number of data points, but you play a ton of baseball, so it's not a huge deal. But yeah, this is basically where I'm at. I've been able to get the numbers up pretty good. And this number is, while this encompasses about 25% of games played, will fall under this probability threshold. This is only about 14% of games played. And so it's going to be an open question as to whether or not the algorithm's only going to pick really heavy favorites or never pick an underdog or something like that. And that's really going to change whether or not you can use something like this to turn a profit, because you will end up having to spend a lot more money if your profit margins are smaller. So these are all open questions, basically. And I am not willing to lose any amount of real money. In fact, what I've been doing thus far is just betting $1 on every game, and I'm slightly up like $10, I think, betting $1 in each game for a couple weeks. So it's promising. It's definitely these methods are definitely promising. They seem to be really, really stable. They seem to be consistent across days. Like, it's very rare that I have a losing day. More often than not, I have like days where I'm 50-50, and then a couple of days where I win, like when I am up a game or two. And then the occasional day where I'm down a game or down two. So in the aggregate, it seems to be really promising, but a lot more things need to be explored. And to be honest, I've probably barely scratched the surface in terms of statistics I'm actually using for the prediction. So data entry is kind of a bitch in this case because you have a ton of pitchers, ton of games, and you have to get each pitcher in each game, and you have to get all the stats for each team in that game entered. And it's not a super simple task. It's not impossible, but I've only been able to do it for last season, 2023, and for all the games up to this season. And I would really like to test and norm on more sets of data, so like 2022 and 2021, because the numbers might look a lot different. But, anyways, this is where I'm at right here. These numbers sort of define how successful I've been at predicting these games. If you'd like to know more, leave a comment. We also have a Patreon, and you could ask me questions directly on there if you just like do the chat thing, or leave a comment on the YouTube or Instagram or anything like that. Happy to talk about this stuff. I'm very new to betting. I don't really feel like I'm betting because I have yet to make a pick of a sports game and put money on it. I am only betting on things that are chosen by my various algorithms, and it seems to be working. Um, I don't know what is like commonly understood as like a good win rate or what you need to win a profit to turn a profit. It seems like you need right around 70 is a good number to aim for, and so I am fairly close here and above there. But again, that's the way that betting works, is that the odds are not in your favor, because even if you can win 80% of the games, the odds are like minus 200, minus 300, you're probably still not winning enough to make a profit on those. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm not quitting my day job, that's for sure. And I will have more updates in the future, especially on the uh, MLB side of things, because there's a lot more games to play, and I'm sure I'll have a lot more ideas. And this stuff will probably change every week. I've basically gone with something new, so this is where I'm at right now, and it's going to change in the future. So, anyways, until next time, see you later.